And get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ezra Calvert with Entrada Insights on behalf of TTRA. Welcome. It's another day, another guest, and we have, as always, lots of interesting points about data and what's happening in the marketplace. Today, Dan Liefeld is our guest. He is the Director of Data Sales for Key Data. As you may have known, Dan, he is a long-time, highly involved figure in the vacation rental industry. He's very hands-on with relationships with vacation rental managers around the world, which gives them a unique understanding of what's happening in this valuable sector in the lodging industry. Of course, there's no shortage of nuances in the vacation rental market, especially right now, as you are looking at these data sources in real-time basis. Lots of good surprises there. And Dan really understands these data sets really, really well. So we are so pleased to have him today with us with TTRA. He's going to walk us through his presentation and how he sees the data and what's happening in the tourism industry right now. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat room. We are going to do something a little different today. I'll try my best to bring those questions while Dan is presenting. So let's see how that works, and let's give a big warm welcome to Dan. Dan, the mic is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Esra, for putting this together. Super excited to be here and present on a topic that is kind of been shoved under the rug a lot, and that is vacation rental data, especially during this pandemic. We've seen hotels really struggle, but in the vacation rental industry, we've seen a little bit of the opposite. And I'm really excited to share you kind of a little bit about what markets are performing, what aren't, who's winning, who's losing, and show you some opportunities within the data. I am Daniel Liefeld, one of the founders of this company. Key Data Dashboard has been around for about 2 years. And what we do is we get data direct from source. It's really something that is extremely hard and hasn't been available in the vacation rental industry ever before. We directly connect with over 40 different property management systems to pull data directly from individual property managers. Pulled up a few examples of what those property managers look like. You'll notice this is some of these are huge companies, some of them are small companies, but that's the beauty of what we've done, is being able to directly connect with individual property managers, pull the stay data and guest data directly from the property manager's property management system. And that's kind of the thing that makes this data unique and one of a kind. We work with over 800 property managers now. Should have updated the slide, I apologize. And all over the world, but the majority of that is in the United States. Probably only have about 100 in the international sector. And we're working with other destinations, or with destinations all over the country. We're based out of Santa Rosa Beach in Florida. So obviously you'll see a lot of Florida destinations on here, but certainly working with others like North Carolina, Big Bear, California, all over the country, providing destinations with what's going on in the vacation rental market. So we'll jump right into this. And the first thing that I want to do is, in order to kind of digest some of this information and present to you in a more effective way, we've broken down the United States into some regions here. So take just a moment and identify your region so that you understand where you fall into, or where your market falls into this map. Obviously, we have the data for individual locations all over the country. That can get a little wild if we start to make statements about individual markets. There are definitely a ton of nuances in those markets, but just to keep things simple, we identified all these regions. So the first thing that I want to bring up is that when COVID hit, no questions. The booking stopped very quickly in response to the federal and state policies that went into place. The mid-Atlantic states were clearly the slowest to fall. And you can really see that with that blue line. They stayed up a little longer than everybody else, and then they came back a little stronger than everybody else. The Southwest never really dipped down quite as far as the other regions. It was a very interesting dynamic when everything really hit, that the bookings just never dipped down quite as far for the Southwest as it did the rest of the country. We were very shocked by that, and we started putting that out right away when we learned it. And I think a big part of that was because they didn't get the global shutdown that a lot of other markets got. So people were still looking to travel, and that's where they found their place. The pent-up demand from the closures really caused immediate spikes upon reopening, and the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast really saw those huge increases in reservation activity in May and June. And forgive me, this chart is showing you the number of bookings that were happening at those times. So this isn't occupancy data or rate data, this is the actual booking data that for those individual dates.
So then a quick question there. Of course, with the Western US, especially with California, the regulations were so strict. Part of it makes sense because just getting in and out of the state, mobility was really challenged.
Yeah.
I'm really surprised with the Southwest destinations. Is that because of pure demand, or what was really happening there? Or is it just the heat?
In this case, I think the bigger piece to this is that the Southwest also includes Arizona. And Arizona was probably the hottest market immediately when COVID hit. For those 2 months, Arizona was spiking pretty high. So I think if we ran the same graph for Arizona alone, you'd see a little bit different picture, because that it would actually be an uptick in bookings that were happening during that time period. So unfortunately, just when you're trying to generalize for an entire group, that's the bigger problem there. So, most markets' bookings really are remaining elevated too, with the exception of the Western and Southwestern states though. So if you look at the tail end of this graph, that the last couple months, the Southwestern and Western states really didn't get the same type of oomph, if you will, that the rest of the United States did. But the Southwest was the first market to indicate recovering booking levels. Like I said, I think that's really influenced by that Arizona peak. So then let's look at the booking window. Because we directly connect with the property management system, we're actually able to see when these bookings actually came in and how far in advance that was for the stay. So one of the things that you're looking at here is the change in the average booking window between 2019 and 2020. And you can see that that booking window just absolutely got reduced tremendously. It's pretty phenomenal to look at this. I mean, you'd kind of expect it for the first part of this year, but really everybody is continuing to have that same feeling of, a lack of consumer sentiment, if you will, about whether or not they're going to be able to take a vacation in 3 weeks in any destination. So they're holding off on making that booking until that last minute. The only thing saving these booking windows is that in the vacation rental industry, most of your reservations actually come, as much as a year in advance. So even though we have a, 15-day booking window or whatever, many of those reservations are actually made a year in advance. Does that make sense? So that's easily the biggest thing that we're seeing is just the booking window. If there's one general statement that you can make about vacation rental data, it's that the booking window really dropped.
I'm also fascinated with this data. I think it just shows people's state of mind. Of course, through April, like things were so uncertain. May, people were lingering, oh, what should I do? What should I do? Stay, go, stay, go. And then June hit. I think everybody got sick of being home and they were ready to take off. And when we look at your data, of course, we see that dump coming right when COVID hit everywhere in March and April. But in June, like that uptick where people are changing their minds, they're sick of being home, and how that mobility also started to kick in.
And the other piece to this is, people who are staying for July, that drop in booking window is also influenced by those people booking a year in advance. So it may look better, but really those are people who just didn't cancel when COVID hit. They still had that reservation on the books for July. So an important piece to think about. Now, I mentioned cancellations. Cancellations exist in the vacation rental industry, and it's pretty normal. However, those cancellations clearly spiked in response to the state and federal restrictions on travel. You can see that very obviously here. I don't think that's a shocker. But there were lots of last minute cancellations that happened as people waited to see if their destinations would reopen. It's one thing that our data scientists really pointed out to me was that many happened in midweek for a stay starting, for example, on Saturday. So people really waited until the very last minute to do that. That is extremely unusual for the vacation rental industry because cancellation policies are much more rigid than you see in the hotel industry. So usually a hotel you can cancel within 1 or 2 days of your stay. With the vacation rental industry, most of those cancellations are paid in full 30 days in advance, paid in 25% at least at 90 days in advance. So if you cancel, you don't get that money back. Now, with COVID, many vacation rental companies fudged on those cancellation policies, but some did not. So it was really interesting to see those cancellations still happen as a result of that 90-day booking or cancellation window that most vacation rentals operate under. I also want to take a moment to point out the difference between a traditional vacation rental and what many people think of when I say vacation rental, which is an RBO, a rent by owner. When we say vacation rental, this is professionally managed vacation rental properties, which is the majority of what you see on VRBO and Airbnb. It's about 60% professionally managed properties and maybe 40% of real RBOs. So an important distinction to make there, because an RBO probably isn't going to refund your money coming out or when it is 90 days out. Whereas a vacation rental company has the ability to say, look, we can work with this and try to make that money up next or through the rest of the year. Just a typical difference between those two types of properties. Huge numbers of trips were canceled. That's the crazy but true statement of the day, is that most spring break stays in the Southeast were canceled. It's a shocker at what that level was. A lot of the announcements were made the first week of spring break, the night before the first week of spring break started. So really a nightmare for vacation rental managers down there, because they then had to communicate with both owners and guests about what was happening due to cancellations. That had huge implications for destinations that really relied on that spring break activity, which we'll talk a bit more about in a few slides. You really see those that mid-Atlantic spike there, as well as pretty much everybody spiked at the same time.
Yeah, especially with Florida, those states, they got really hurt with those early on cancellations.
Absolutely. So, the rates really fell as well during this time, which isn't really a shocker, but the average daily rate for the West had the most dramatic fall. The Southeast bounced back the fastest though. You'll see with the reopening announcements, they really came back very quickly. And you see that big spike there in between April and May. Destinations that reopened with the higher rates than last year in an effort to recover some of the lost revenue from the spring. That was something that we liked to see. The vacation rental industry has never really had the ability to look at market data to try to push rate. And so being able to use key data to do that, we were glad to see that people were actually utilizing that feature of being able to see them versus the rest of the market. And make sure that they were in line with the rest of the market. So really liked to see that people were really trying to push those rates and see what happened rather than discounting their way out of it, which, as we all know, doesn't really work. Also, the added visibility coming from a revenue management tool really helped them just push those rates in early 2020.
So Dan, you mentioned that about 60% are professionally managed vacation rentals. So I would make the assumption that that is also a professional way of dealing with pricing and revenue management with all those cancellations that has taken place back in, especially in April or so. Do you see that with the price push, those professionally managed organizations, vacation rentals, do you think that was a factor in there? Because when we look at the hotel industry, especially in some markets, I am really seeing ADR bleeding, and it's really concerning, whether it's RevPAR or ADR. It's a red flag for the industry. We don't want to see what happened back in the previous recession, especially in the financial crisis. This time is a little bit different. Like, this data is like so encouraging to me. Not only pricing fluctuated right away, but also the real estate market in majority of the country is doing well. So are these really good, healthy indicators from a recovery perspective? I know you work with property managers very closely. What are some anecdotal things that you are hearing from them in regards to the health of the industry and health of the economy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's got a lot of different answers. To be honest with you, the anecdotal evidence that we see is really, it comes down to, if you're in a true leisure market where you can distance yourself, you can basically name your price for a vacation rental and you'll get it. So most vacation rental managers, and this is a really important thing to understand, we're not hotels. These are individually owned properties that are having somebody else manage that property. So in a case, let's just keep the math simple. If you own a home, you're renting it out for $100 a night. The vacation rental manager is only getting 20% of that. Typically, I mean, that ranges from anywhere from 15 to 40%, but on average, I would say it's about 20 to 25% of the reservation is coming to the vacation rental manager. That vacation rental manager is having to really make up for all that lost ground in April and May with raising their rates through the rest of the year. That's where their opportunity to maybe save their business is coming from. So these vacation rental managers are trying maybe a little bit harder than a hotel would to raise their rates, and they're finding out that they can get it. And that's not only saving that vacation rental manager, but it's saving the vacation rental industry a little bit, because you're seeing that across the board. People are pushing their rate to get back what they lost during that downward trend, and they don't have the backing of $1 billion hotel agency to bring them back, whether they made it or not. These are vacation rental managers who are literally feeding their families off of this. So they're really more adamant about pushing that rate as high as they possibly can to get that money back. And I've seen that across the board, and every property manager that I talk with, that's what their strategy has had to be coming out of COVID. So occupancy has generally recovered across the board for vacation rentals, at least back to normal occupancy for this time of year. They might not have recovered all of what they lost or made up for and gone even with 2019. That's some of it, but that adjusted paid occupancy really kicks out owner stays and maintenance holds. So that's what you're looking at on the screen is adjusted paid occupancy. Again, because we're able to connect with the property management system, we can kick out those owner stays, which is a vital piece of the pie when you're looking at vacation rentals. The drops by month depends on how far the market could fall. So that's what we're looking at here is by the drops in percentage points that they dropped. So for example, if occupancy is normally 70%, maximum that market could drop is 70% on this graph. So just so you understand what you're looking at here. Obviously, some markets might only have a 20% occupancy rate, so they could only drop 20%. So just wanted to point that out before we move on this slide. But March was really tough on that adjusted paid occupancy. Rocky Mountain ski areas had to close early that week, and that was a big deal. And probably the biggest takeaway from the screen is just that those Rocky Mountain areas, they're still really heavily booked in March, and they lost a ton of that occupancy because of COVID, because of state regulations, because of COVID. That really happened kind of out of nowhere and caught a lot of them by surprise. And April was really tough for spring break destinations in the Southeast. You see that dip there. And then the Southwest had the biggest increases over last year. June and July were really generally good coming out of COVID. So another little takeaway from that screen. So some COVID takeaways. Cancellations really spiked in response to local and federal policy. Bookings and cancellations responded immediately as places began shutting down or restricting travel. And there were lots of last minute reservations after reopening. Some increases in occupancy have been due to more owner stays. The vacation rental dialogue around the new normal for vacation rentals being long-term stays and COVID vacations were generally not true. The data you're looking at really matters. You have to be able to separate owner stays when you're evaluating your vacation rental performance, or you can make some really terrible assumptions. A great example of this is Cape Cod, for example, this spring. You may have seen some articles regarding stays all throughout the Northeast, but specifically Cape Cod, having COVID vacations, and the new normal was long-term stays. And there was a lot of conversation, a lot of people writing about this, and it didn't make sense to us. And we really dove into the data. The reason this happened was because everybody was showing that occupancy was up when they looked at it from a scraped data perspective, because you're not able to see owner stays and maintenance holds. Well, if you can't see that it's a maintenance hold, or because a lot of owners, by the way, when COVID started, they said, no, you know what, clean my property and then take it off, because I don't want to do a deep clean of the property. That way there's no COVID in it and we're done renting until further notice. Well, if you did that, all of a sudden that unit was unavailable on the property calendars on the OTA websites. So if you're getting scraped data, it's going to look like occupancy. To see that that's an owner stay is really vital, because when Cape Cod was having these massive spikes in occupancy, it was just a bunch of people from Boston who were going to their vacation rental that they have out on the Cape and getting out of the city when COVID hit. And it was just owner stays. So no revenue coming in from those. So those terrible assumptions that I talk about, that's really what it comes down to, is being able to see owner stays or not. You see on this graph, we're looking at the different mountain areas throughout the US, and you see a ton of owner occupancy in these places. These are people who wanted to get out of the cities where they live and get away, and they own this home anyway, so why not take advantage of that social distancing capability?
I find this data very fascinating because, I mean, just talking to different mountain resorts, beach resorts, everybody has a different perspective on the data. They are looking at shared economy, vacation rentals, they're looking at STR data. Every data is telling a different piece of the puzzle. But nobody really talks about the owner occupancy. I don't see that much often. So when you report that owner occupancy, that's reported as a separate metrics. So when I look at this, is the demand really increased from a paid perspective? Like, what is the takeaway for us?
I think that the takeaway is that the owner occupancy can really skew your data. So, for example, in Jackson Hole, the owner occupancy went way up while the paid occupancy went way down. So it really depends on your market. And so the takeaway is you watch your owner occupancy, and if you can't get that, find somebody who can give it to you, because the owner occupancy can really skew everything. Um, Cape Cod being a wonderful example. It was a very in your face thing that came out right when COVID first started. That's why I use it as an example. But Jackson Hole is another great example. If you were just looking at total occupancy, you'd say, hey, we're in line with last year. But in reality, it's a pretty big hit for somewhere where you can really social distance. It's one of the only markets in the country where occupancy is down that you can socially distance, because you won't get much more socially distant than Jackson Hole. But when you look at somewhere like Western North Carolina, for example, extremely high numbers in occupancy, revenue, ADR, and they're getting it because they're able to socially distance. Well, we can see that their actual paid occupancy is high, while Jackson Hole here, for example, is way down.
The numbers are still encouraging though. If I'm looking at
Yes.
paid occupancy in some of those markets, some of the traditional sectors, they have seen 3 times, 2 times higher decreases. So in the scheme of things, everything is relative. So
Right.
even though paid occupancy could be low, it's encouraging. It's still encouraging.
One across the board, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you see, if I would have told you 6 months, well, I guess 3 months ago now, that occupancy in Park City was going to be essentially even with last year, you would have told me in this situation, if you will. The drive-to markets that opened early and have more houses than condos were really able to stack the deck in 2020 and be able to make a lot of that money back, and get that occupancy up to where it needs to be and make that money back. The domestic spring break locations really saw a huge rush. After the foreign travel was banned. A lot of people take cruises and a lot of people go on backpacking trips across Europe or whatever, and they couldn't do that this year. So domestic spring break locations really saw the huge rush when the ban was initially announced. Houses really recovered faster than condos, thanks to the introduction of this new term we all love so much called social distancing. And Memorial Day weekend really exposed some regional trends, as you can see in the colored map here, of some markets that are, who are doing better during that specific time, and markets that suffered. And then Southeast beach destinations really had a better summer than last year. This is the last piece of that. And I hate to refer to them as losers, but I really didn't know what else to call it. It's a little bit of a harsh term here, but the losers were the fly-in markets, urban markets, condo markets. I'm talking Orlando, Jackson Hole, Hawaii. People didn't want to get on planes. People weren't allowed to visit Hawaii, for example. or essentially not allowed to visit. And so that's kind of what we're seeing across the board. I want to point out, like, Orlando's vacation rental market still really terribly lags behind last year in occupancy. And a big part of that is that they've made it very hard to visit their theme parks if you're not staying at their resort. So that's why you're seeing vacation rentals, which are traditionally not part of the resort, still lagging behind. And then the last piece of this COVID kind of follow-up, if you will, is the event-driven pain. So a great example of this is the Coachella Film Festival. The postponement to the fall was announced on 3/10, and cancellations shot straight through the roof. Then the same thing happened again when they canceled the makeup days in the fall. So postponements and cancellations of events have really been reflected in wild reservation activity for vacation rentals in places like Austin for South by Southwest, Gulf Shores for the Hangout, and many more. This was just a great example with Coachella because we got to see it twice. We saw the same thing happen twice. We saw when they moved the dates, all of a sudden bookings spiked, and then all of a sudden the cancellations tanked when they canceled it again. So interesting thing that we've been able to track with the movement of events.
So when you are looking at some of the future events, and you said looking ahead on your slide, those destinations that are especially event driven, are you seeing any positive take in terms of looking at forward? Are there some positive signs that some of these events, are they going to come back? What are you seeing in terms of signs? Of course, we don't know everything, but I think there's some signals that are out there we can pay attention to.
I didn't really look at anything specific for this, but we certainly, most of these events, these big events, are not happening. So they didn't even make a makeup date. They just said for 2020 that event's canceled, which is what they did for Coachella, right? So looking forward to next year would be the answer to that question. And I think that I would say across the board, and we talked kind of anecdotally at the start, before this presentation, Ezra, that for next year, we're already pacing ahead of where we were this year, as of last year's at this time. So
that's so encouraging.
We're pacing quite a bit ahead. We get into a little bit of that in the next few slides, but generally speaking, for many markets, we're pacing already ahead for next year. And some of that's because people literally moved their vacation rental reservations from this year when COVID happened and they needed to cancel that reservation. The property manager said, hey, how about we just move you to next year and you come back next year? And a lot of people did take advantage of that offer and did do that. So I think that's part of the reason that the reservations are up for next year. But I think a much bigger part of that is a lot of people said, man, we need to at least have something to look forward to for next year. And hopefully there's a vaccine and people are all ready to fly and everything goes wonderfully next year. We're hoping for that, but we'll see. But that's what we are seeing in the data, is that for next year, generally speaking, maybe not event driven, people are planning way further in advance. So let's go ahead and look ahead a little bit. Most of this data is for the remainder of this year. Maybe a little early to start looking at next year, but we should be starting to look at it. So there are a couple of slides that talk about it. So there's no huge changes in adjusted paid occupancy year over year for the remainder of this year. There is, obviously, it's right in line with last year's numbers, and that is very encouraging. The Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, the Rocky Mountain region are all up in September, but the West continues to lag just a little bit behind where they were last year at this time. But you can see that regionally, the occupancy is tightly in line with last year for the remainder of the year. And that's really encouraging, just to see that those markets are kind of at least in line with where they were last year. rates for all destinations were higher in August. So that's a really exciting factor. The rate has come back more or less across the board. The different approaches are very apparent, though. You can increase rates to make more money at the risk of losing occupancy, or you can drop rates to drive up occupancy. And a huge part of this strategic decision is based on what policies will be in place, for example, with ski areas. I happen to live in Colorado. It's a wonderful place to live, unless there's a 40,000 acre fire burning right next to you, which is the situation I'm in. But the ski areas, for example, I think everybody in Colorado who's associated with ski areas is holding their breath, because our governor is prone to shut things down when anything gets bad. And with the ski areas, may not even be allowed to open. It may not even be a question of whether people are willing to ski. It's going to be a question of whether they're allowed to open. Many of the resorts, when COVID first came out, went ahead and shut down on their own anyway, which is, I guess, a good thing, but something that we're really going to be watching very closely as the winter season comes. I've got an interesting slide about that in just a couple of slides here, regarding specific ski areas in Colorado and what their outlook is for the season. So we'll maybe touch on that a little bit. Now, booking window. This is something that we're watching very closely, because it is, like I said, probably the easiest general statement you can say about the vacation rental industry is that booking window has shortened. And the average booking windows are much longer for October through December this year than they were last year at this point. So it's an interesting topic that we've run into. People really planned fall vacations early on this year before COVID happened, or they moved reservations from the spring to August and September. And so there's still more last minute reservations that will bring those booking windows down. But that points to a lack of consumer confidence in what that travel outlook is going to be. So really going to be interesting to watch what happens with these booking windows over the next couple of months. The God's honest truth is that if that booking window starts to fall for the next few months, that's actually kind of a good indicator that people are going to be traveling during those time periods, who maybe we didn't really expect to. I don't think there's a lot of reservations that happened typically in the past for those next couple months. So interesting.
I'm seeing around anywhere 2 to 3 weeks from a booking window. I mean, for some destinations, it's even 2 weeks, which used to be, the booking window was extending when the economy was so good. Even back in early winter, it feels like a century. But that's a drastic change that we are seeing. How many days are you anticipating the average booking? Just on average, are you looking at 2 to 3 weeks, just like everyone else, or?
That's even a question that is very, I'm not going to answer it the way you want me to. And part of the reason is because you still have some small events that are happening. You still have, better times to be in some markets than others. And when school all starts, that changes drastically as well. So the way I'm going to answer it is I'm going to say that it's going to be probably down about 2 weeks from where it normally is. Because that's what we are seeing across the board, is that subtle drop in occupancy, or in booking window by about 2 weeks once the date gets here. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. Very helpful.
So then we go to average length of stay. And this is, like I mentioned, it's probably the most anticipated thing that we all thought was going to happen. Everybody and their mom said the vacation rental guest is going to be a longer stay. It's the new normal in vacation rentals. It is increasing in the Southwest, the West, and the Rocky Mountains, but man, not by much. Maybe a day. In the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic, the average length of stay is really fairly consistent with what it normally is. That was, like I said, a really highly anticipated expectation that never really came to fruition in the vacation rental space. And now that we're past it and we say, okay, why? We can say, well, of course not, because number one, guests still have to pay for that extra time out of vacation rental. And not everybody has an extra $5,000 sitting around to pay for that extra week. Yeah, their kids don't have to be back home to go to school, but they still do have to pay for that extra time if they want to stay somewhere. And then the bigger piece of it is really that the availability calendar has to be open for them to have that extended stay. Like I mentioned, a lot of these stays are booked a year in advance for a week long, and that's going to take a week out of the availability calendar. So if somebody wanted to stay for a whole month, they can't because it's booked 2 weeks from now. So that's the other piece that's kind of keeping that average length of stay down.
And it's a really puzzle because we all have been talking about that extended stay in the industry, but nobody really talks about the owner occupied days. So I really wonder if that has some sort of an influence when we are looking at those rentals. It's really a big puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. And I think that that's going to be the stay that happens as we get into the school year. You know, somebody who works in Denver and owns a, 4-bedroom home up in Breckenridge is going to go stay there when school starts because they don't really want, their kids aren't going to be going to in-person school. They're going to be doing online school. They have great Wi-Fi in Breckenridge and the house is prettier. So why not go spend a week up there while you're working from home and sending your kids to school from home, and the availability calendar is open? Your owner occupancy is gonna go up during that time period for sure, and we are seeing that. Can't touch on everything in the slideshow.
We don't know everything.
Great conversation though. The other thing here is these 4 markets in the Southeast really seem to be benefiting from those changes in the school calendar. The extended summers, the homeschooling from anywhere, they're getting higher occupancy and higher rates for 2009 or than they got in 2019. They also have a large population of potential drive markets. They're also destinations predominantly made up of houses. So these particular areas are getting that extended shoulder season that we were expecting, but we weren't sure if it was going to happen. And we're finally starting to see that among the houses because people aren't having to go back to school. They've been able to say, okay, well, we weren't able to go anywhere in July, but now we can start to go somewhere maybe August and September because our kids still aren't going to be in school. We can go have a little more fun in what would normally be a shoulder season. Now, when we look at this chart, let me just explain it real quick. Because this is a pacing chart, you're essentially rooting for the blue line, 2020, to pass the green line, 2019. The gray line is where we ended up in 2019. So that's kind of the mark that we're trying to achieve at some point. But as long as the blue line's ahead of the green line, we're in good shape right now. So the question here is, how will ski resorts handle social distancing? Will government step in and shut it down? So in these ski markets, let's look at that for a little bit. Colorado is a predominantly drive-in destination, while Jackson Hole is largely a fly-in destination. It's really early to make predictions on what is expected, but Colorado's ski destinations seem to be ahead while others aren't quite where we'd expect them to be normally. So you're really starting to see, like Aspen, for example, way up in occupancy compared to where they normally are for now for ski season. Compare that to somebody like Lake Tahoe, lagging quite a bit behind last year as far as pacing goes. Obviously, everything can change at the drop of a hat, especially when you have a booking window that's 30 days out. But having that jump start of an extra 5 or 10% like Aspen has is a big deal. And I have no idea why. I live less than an hour from Aspen, but I have no idea why Aspen is that far ahead of where they were last year at this time. That's probably one of the more interesting realizations that we've got on this. Spring break destinations are very unlikely to recover that lost revenue. We've talked about some property managers being able to make up some of that lost revenue, but spring break destinations like these really struggled during March and April, and we really thought some might make up that revenue in the fall. They just haven't. While they're pacing close to last year for RevPAR, that's what this screen is showing is RevPAR, just want to make that clear. It really hasn't been high enough to offset the lower spring revenue. These are markets with a really high percentage of inventory being condos, and they traditionally have tons of crowds. Generally speaking, these are two things that travelers are avoiding right now. So that's why these destinations, for example, are really struggling from a RevPAR perspective.
Dan, does that have to do with more density and the condo market mostly?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're saying on these in these three markets. They're predominantly condo markets, so people are not willing to go press that elevator button or go to the beach with 4,000 of their friends. That's probably the biggest piece on these destinations.
And the pattern is almost identical, very similar.
Yes, exactly. And the urban markets had an adjusted RevPAR that was way down for spring through summer, but we're finally beginning to see that trend toward normal. So looking at, your Orlando market, obviously struggling because of Disney and the theme park atmosphere, if you will, that people don't want to go where there's a billion people. Miami-Dade County, tons of bad press. San Francisco Bay Area, just being high density, and Washington, D.C. metro area is also having that same situation.
And these are also international markets. So I think part of the dip and stress that we are seeing is driven for losing that international demand.
Right on. And last minute bookings are the current normal and have been since travel bans were lifted in May. This chart really shows when people who booked in a given week are staying. This is simply an example. We didn't even put the market name on here because it's sort of irrelevant. We're seeing this across the board. When the peaks are on the left, that means that bookings are happening with less lead time. We're seeing this trend in almost every single market, with almost nothing on the right side of the graph and a ton of stuff on the left side. That's not unique to any individual area. So the takeaways from all of this, let's box it all up in a pretty little package for you, is that regional and local variation exists tremendously. You saw that with the different ski markets, for example, fly-in versus drive-in. We're not trying to generalize everybody into one box, but in the interest of giving you insight, we did have to put some regional effort in there. If you want your individual markets data, I'm happy to speak with you outside of this. That's coming up. The type of market really matters tremendously, whether it's houses or condos, whether it's fly to or drive to, whether it's crowded or secluded. Those are all really important factors right now in how your individual market is doing. So you'll probably be able to answer some of your questions by looking at that and making those assumptions, because they're absolutely in line with what is actually happening. It's exactly what you think it is. The booking activity continues to be very abnormal with shorter booking windows. The stay lengths are pretty similar to what they usually are, and owner stays are definitely skewing data. So when you're looking at your vacation rental data and trying to figure out what's happening, those owner stays are probably the most important dynamic that you have to look at. And finally, things change quickly. With a 30-day booking window, everything can change very quickly. Keep your finger on the pulse and you'll be fine. That's kind of our motto here at Key Data. So with that, if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them for you.
Oh, thank you, Dan. And if anybody has questions, we can take those questions through the chat feature. I found the occupancy figures very eye-opening. I mean, we have been all paying attention to occupancy, but they're closed properties, open properties. It's just like a maze. Nobody can make sense of it. So showing that owner occupied percentages, even ADR, that was extremely eye-opening from a rental market perspective. There are a lot of blurring boundaries. So I think for destinations, it's always good to have that commercial activity as well as quality of life. What are you seeing in terms of looking at some of the trends from a DMO perspective, from a messaging perspective? DMOs have been very highly facing residents, of course, the second home owners, rental unit owners. They are also part of the equation now too. They are part residents, part travelers, part business owners. What are you seeing in terms of this changing business practice, changing business messaging from a DMO perspective?
That's a loaded question there.
It's a loaded. So I want to see how you feel about the industry. It's more about your take on working with these property owners and what you see in the industry. Change is accelerating. That's the norm. So I'm really curious to see your perspective. And being in Colorado, you are seeing that vacation rental industry very closely. What do you see from a destination management and marketing perspective?
For most DMOs, I think the number one thing that we're seeing is a real concentration on those drive-to markets, being able to market to those drive-to markets and saying, what other drive-to markets have we kind of neglected because we were trying to get that fly-in market that is opening a gate or whatever it is to come. Really being able to focus on those drive-to markets is the biggest thing that we're seeing from a DMO perspective. The other thing is a lot of DMOs are really being floated by the vacation rental industry. When nobody wants to stay in a hotel and their occupancy is down 80% and the destinations vacation rental market is perhaps up by 20-30%, which is happening in some markets in the country, the DMOs are starting to say, oh, hey, these vacation rental managers are not only important, but might be the most important sector to our economy, because you're not talking about two people going and staying in a hotel room. You're talking about 20 people staying in a 17-bedroom house, or whatever it is. So, and the amount of money that comes along with that. When you have some markets that have maybe a $27,000 average booking value.
That's a lot.
You have a lot of money in those situations, right? And these destinations are saying, wait a second, if we can attract 2 or 3 more of those people, now all of a sudden, what's that going to do to our budget? So just being able to say, okay, let's reevaluate the landscape here, see how important these are, and making vacation rentals a much bigger part of your priority list about what to promote has been one of the biggest shifts that we've seen through the pandemic is, oh, hey, these guys aren't a nuisance like a lot of news stories say. It really is a matter of, wow, these are business people who are running good businesses that are bringing valuable guests. You might hear about 3 or 4 house parties, but the rest of everything that you see is all positive because there's thousands of vacation rental bookings in your market at any given time. So the additional revenue that's coming in from the vacation rental market has been a big eye opener for a lot of destinations.
I love what you said. First, from that recovery, looking at micro to macro. And second, let's evaluate the landscape here. I think that's so important. I think that's what everyone is doing. The players are not necessarily drastically changing. I think we are opening our eyes to those players that we haven't really paid attention to. And tourism is having a bigger presence from a destination perspective. But let's reevaluate. I love what you emphasize on there. So within that, let's go back to the consumers a little bit. What do you think is going to stick from a trend perspective? Like the behavior from booking to length of stay, owner occupied units, like all of those are fascinating to me. What are you seeing from a trends perspective that's going to stick, and a different consumer who is evolving?
Well, I'm going to point out first a couple of things that I don't think will stick. That average booking window is not going to be shorter next year and the next year. And it's going to be very important when you look at for next year, when you start to look at what the changes are. Don't look at your average booking window versus this year, because it's going to be a different story. People are going to come feel better about traveling again, and that's going to make a big difference on that average booking window. Now, what I do think is going to change or remain changed is that vacation rentals are going to be a much bigger part of people's travel thoughts. I can't say nobody, but the amount of people who are looking for a hotel to stay in versus a vacation rental, I think people are going to experience going to a vacation rental this year versus a hotel, and they're going to say, wow, I didn't have to bring I was able to eat out. I didn't have to get 6 different hotel rooms. I didn't have to, be with a whole bunch of other people. I had my own private pool. I had my own private barbecue. I had my own space and could do what I wanted and didn't have to see other people for a while. And isn't that what vacations are all about? So, I think that that's going to be the biggest thing that changes as a result of all of this, and it's going to be a permanent change. Is I think vacation rentals have really been turned on to a lot of people as a result of all this, because there's no better way to socially distance, and there's no better way to really experience a location, a destination than vacation rentals compared to a hotel.
One last question. What about family time? We are spending a ton of time with our families right now, stuck in our houses. How is that going to change, do you think? People are still going to cherish it, or we need distance?
Well, speaking as somebody with 3 kids, all under 5, I will say that I've found a huge appreciation for the time that I spend with my kids, and being able to experience some more things, and being a bigger part of their lives than I was before. Not that I was an absentee father, but when we look at when the kids are home with you all day and they're home with you at night when you're not working, you maybe experienced a few things throughout the day that were good. And to identify that, wow, we need to get back to a point where we're spending more time as a family, doing things as a family. I think that's a really important distinction that's happening as a result of all of this. Is that we're finding that we like each other a little bit, and man, it'd be nice to go on a vacation with them. I know I'm really looking forward to taking my first plane ride out of here. With the family and going somewhere where we can just be a family and I'm not working. That's going to be a huge thing for people coming out of COVID, is kind of breaking those chains. So.
I love it. Oh, Dan, this was fascinating. I love the data. It brings a lot of different perspectives to everyone. So thank you so much for your time today. The recording and the slides are going to be emailed to everyone, and it will also stay on the TTRA website. So I encourage everyone to share the recording, the slides with each other. Lots of good stuff here. As a closing remark, thank you so much for your time, for your insights. This was delightful. And for next week, I just want to give everyone heads up. The Asia Pacific chapter is holding a session. They're going to talk about innovation. It's going to be at Tuesday night around 11 p.m. Eastern. But if you cannot join, just listen to the recording. It's going to be another fascinating session. So then, thank you so much. If people have questions, your email is also listed on this slide deck. So we want to make sure that everybody has access to it, and they can also go to keydatadashboard.com website. There's a ton of good resource here. Thank you again, and we wish everyone a wonderful day, and then we'll be in touch. Thank you.